Welcome, friends. We're so glad that you joined us today for our continuing study of the book of Acts. We're studying today from the 5th chapter of the book. And as we look at this, we remember that in the 4th chapter of the book, persecution began for the apostles and for the church. Peter and John were arrested. They were arrested because they were preaching, and that they were preaching in the name of Jesus Christ, the resurrection from the dead. And as their preaching continued, they had been forbidden on that first imprisonment not to teach anymore in the name of Jesus. And the apostles had said then, whether it's right in the sight of God, to hearken unto you rather than unto God, judge you. We cannot but speak the things which we saw and heard. It was only a foretaste of more severe persecution to come. And so as the apostles continued their teaching, it was that became more and more something that was irritating to the Sadducees. It was contrary to their belief that there was such a thing as the resurrection from the dead. The apostles were teaching to the contrary of the doctrine that Jesus had been crucified by them for the sins of man and that he had been raised from the dead. They tolerated as long as they thought they could. Then they arrested all of the apostles and they thrust them into prison. They thought they had them secure, but you cannot fight against God. And these men were to learn, to their astonishment and their dismay, that all of the bonds that they put on these apostles would not hold them. For an angel of the Lord came that night and released them from their prison cell and told them to go and preach in the temple. The next day they did. And the rulers gathered together, altogether unconscious of what had happened to the apostles. And so they sent the officers to bring the apostles, and they found them. And they found the one standing before the cells, and everything was intact. But when they opened the doors, the apostles were not there. They were astonished. Someone came and told them, the men you're searching for are in the temple preaching. So they went for them, and they brought them, but without any violence, because they feared the multitude. For the apostles at this point in history was that was well favored with the people. And so when they stood before them again, they said, we strictly charged you not to teach any more in this name. And lo, you fill the city with your teaching, and you intend to bring the blood of this man upon our hands. But the answer that the apostles did not comfort them, for the apostles said, we must obey God rather than man. Then Peter launched into the fact that they had killed Jesus Christ, and that now, though they were saying, you intend to bring the blood of this man up on our heads, our hands, Peter says, you did kill him. And this was quite a switch from their cries when they wanted Jesus crucified. And when Pilate washed his hands in their midst and said, this is an innocent man. I'm not going to have anything to do with his death, though he did. And he took a basin of water and symbolically washed his hands and said, I'm free from the blood of this man. You see to it. They said, his blood be on us and on our children. Well, now the story is switched, and they're feeling the pinch of being in that limelight they didn't want to be, of ones that were murderers. So the apostles said to them, we must obey God rather than man. The Bible teaches that man has a responsibility to civil government. Jesus taught that. In the book of Matthew, in the 22nd chapter, Jesus said these words to the crowds that were around him, and specifically to those that were ones that sought to put him at variance with the Roman authorities. They asked him, is it lawful to pay tribute to Caesar or not? Must we pay taxes? They thought to get him in trouble with with the rulers of the Romans, or else with the people themselves. Jesus called for a coin, and they brought it to him. And he held up the coin, and he asked them, whose inscription is this? And they said, it's Caesar's. And Jesus responded to them, well, then render to Caesar the things that be Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. The Bible teaches we have a responsibility to civil government. Paul teaches the same in the book of Romans, the 13th chapter, and says, let every soul be in subjection to the higher powers, for there is no power but of God, and the powers that be are ordained of God. You obey your rulers, those that are ones that are in the control of your government and of your physical life. God did ordain government. But there is one realm in which government, though it has much to do with our lives, one realm that government has no oversight over. It can rule in regard to the outer man. It cannot rule in regard to the inner man. But through the years, there have been those that have thought they could, and governments that thought they could tell people how and who they should worship. For instance, you remember the story in the book of Daniel, when it was that in the 3rd chapter, Nebuchadnezzar, the mighty king of Babylon, had built and made a huge golden image. And he came to call his people together. Say, when you hear the music, when you hear the sounds of all these instruments, then you bow down and you worship this image of mine. He thought that people would all submit, and most of them did. But there were 3 Jewish lads in the midst of that number, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, that had been taught of the eternal God, and they believed the eternal God, and they knew that image of gold was not God, and they would not bow down to it. Nebuchadnezzar thought that he could rule in regard to who men were to worship. Nebuchadnezzar learned differently, for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were preserved by the very God he was defying, and by commanding them to worship some other god. In the days of early Christians, we find that Roman Caesars likewise wanted people to worship them as God. They didn't care what they did through the week, through the month. They didn't care. What they wanted was the allegiance of the people honoring Caesar as Lord. And Christians, among others, recommended you take a pinch of incense, you burn it, and you say, Caesar is Lord. And Christians could not, for there is one Lord. And as a consequence of this, conflict grew intense and tense, and Christians suffered for decades and for hundreds of years from those who thought that because they were rulers, they could command people who they were to worship. But men not only has that thought, there are those through the ages that think that they can tell men that they must worship God in some different way. And sometimes in our world, there are those nations that do not believe in God at all and forbid that instructions about that living God should be preached or proclaimed. But not only does government have no right to rule in the matters of who we should worship, government has no right to rule in the things that God has given as far as the moral values of the inner man that is replicated in the outer man's experience and in his life. We find that government says you can go to the civil courts after you've gotten married, and you can get a decree of a dissolving of that marriage for any cause you want. God said differently. God said that marriage is for life, that a man marries a woman, and both of them are to live together as long as both they live. God gave one solution, one exception to that. Matthew 19, he said, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. And he that marrieth her when she's put away commits adultery. Jesus teaches me the only way I can divorce my wife and remarry someone else is that my mate has been one guilty of sexual immorality and been unfaithful to me. And government thinks that they can decree other things of a moral nature of the inner man. Government thinks it can decree that a man can marry a man, a woman can marry a woman. woman. But God has said to the contrary. God said not only is marriage for life, God said that the woman was made for man. And a marriage, in God's sight, can only exist between a man and a woman. It cannot be regarded by God as lawful. It is an abomination in His sight when it is a marriage between a man and a woman and a woman. Now, sometimes our government looks at such things, as we've said, as hateful speech. No, it's not hateful unless you want to call God hateful. And we should be very careful how we think of God. We need to respect Him. But not only does government seek, as it were, to regulate the moral life of a man by telling him he can divorce for any cause and marry whoever he wants to. If he wants to marry a man, he can. If a woman wants to marry a woman, she can. He seeks to regulate our moral life in other ways. We find that government teaches that the life of a child that's still unborn is that can be snuffed out, just like you step on an ant and it's dead. So without any purpose at all and without any measures of reaction that is a punishment, a woman can end the birth of her pregnancy and bear no guilt in the sight of God. But that infant is alive. It is a living being. And no matter what our government says, it is murder. We need to remember that we must obey God rather than man. We must obey our government. But if the time ever comes that our nation tells us that you cannot worship God, you cannot teach about Him, then may God give us the courage, the strength, and the audacity, yes, the audacity to say we must obey God rather than man. Thank you for listening. Continue our studies with us next week.